Greetings, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with artist and author Jaime Cortez. I'm Michael Takeuchi, and I'm events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, Santa Barbara, California's 47-year-old independent bookstore, owned by our founder, Mari Curley. To purchase tonight's book, browse other books, or check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. Speaking of our website, if you purchase via that, you can get Santa Barbara's own T.C. Boyle's latest book, Talk to Me, in signed form. Our next event will be on Thursday at 7 p.m., where fire experts Stephen J. Pine and David Carl will join us to talk about their respective books. While our guests and I are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, please feel free to utilize the chat or the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. We hope to get to your questions. Tonight's event is being simulcasted on and being recorded for our YouTube channel and will be available to view after program's completion. If you're on YouTube, like many of you are right now, please feel free to type in your questions via the chat. So let's begin. Tonight, we welcome Jaime Cortez, the author of Gordo Stories. Jaime is a graphic novelist, visual artist, writer, teacher, activist, and occasional performer. Jaime has historically used art and humor to explore sexuality, social justice, HIV/AIDS, and Chicana identity, which we're celebrating this month. His book is a wonderful piece of work filled with incredible stories. But the New York Times wrote it better than I ever could when they said Jaime's book superpower is it's the cultivation of empathy. And as well, NPR crowed that John Steinbeck might not be the #1 literary pride of Watsonville for long. High praise, but deserved praise indeed. Please welcome Jaime Cortez. Hello, how are you?
Hello. Good evening, Michael. Good evening, everyone who's there listening in today, and thank you to Chaucer's Books.
Well, thank you for coming. It's an incredible book, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But you grew up in San Juan Bautista in Watsonville, and I wanted to ask you about your own childhood first, and what it was like for you growing up in that area, just south of the Bay Area.
I think, yeah. So just for placement, San Juan Bautista is in San Benito County, about 40 miles south of San Jose, and Watsonville is nearby on the coast, just about equidistant between Santa Cruz and Monterey. So two different communities, both of them very agricultural at the time that I grew up there. And what I would say about growing up there, especially in San Juan during my younger years in San Juan Bautista, at the time it was a quite small town, definitely less than 2,000 people. And I think it's almost still at that population level. So it has remained a wonderful small ag town. And I think the thing that I would most say is, it was that growing up there on the migrant farm worker camps, it was, in the 70s. The 1970s, and it was the tail end of kind of an era when it was really common for farm laborers to work as families, and so little kids would be out there working on the weekends. There could be sometimes 3 generations of family at work in the same place. That has since, I don't know if it's completely disappeared, but you certainly don't see it the way you used to see it when it was very common for little kids to be out there. And for us, that was normal in the same way that, a princess will normalize growing up in a castle and with all that comes with it. Or, a kid can normalize growing up on a houseboat if that's how they grew up. I think we completely normalized the experience of growing up in a farm worker camp. And for us, it was just normal that our life involved work. It was normal that we did not have indoor toilets. It was normal that nobody on the farm in the camp had a telephone. That was all normal to us. Over time,
Wow.
of course, and in many ways, I often think of the farm worker camp as a kind of a Mexican village surrounded on all sides by California. Uh, and uh, Eventually, though, you get out of the bubble, and as a kid, and you start going to school, and at a certain point, you realize, oh, we're poor, we're low income, and you
Hmm.
start to understand like where you stand socioeconomically. Um, so I would say that about that growing up time. Um,
Interesting. When you realize this, I'm wondering what are you thinking when you said that, oh, we're poor. As a child, that can be very affect you very deeply, I would think.
I think there is a couple of things that came up. I think the first thing is that like when you realize that, I think almost at the same time and holding hands with that realization is a sense that it's a little shameful. It's embarrassing. It's shameful
Mhm.
to be poor, to have less than. It feels in some ways almost like having less than makes you less than.
Mhm.
And I think that there was a certain amount of kind of embarrassment at being,
Mhm.
low income.
Mhm.
And I think it took a long time for me to kind of work through that and understand that it was a state of being, and it wasn't a reflection about whether we were better or worse than anyone else. It's just that's where we landed socioeconomically for a bunch of
Mhm.
different reasons, broad societal international reasons that drive migration, that drive labor forces. All of that was playing into it. So
Mm. So when you're younger, did you also have to deal with the language barrier? Because I'm sure when you're younger, you spoke predominantly Spanish.
so growing up in our house, we spoke Spanish those first few years as a little kid. We lived immediately next door to family members, and some
Mhm.
of those kids were just a few years older than us, and they had started going to school, and they could speak English pretty well, some of them. And I was also before school started, I was a TV junkie.
Ah.
And I used to watch Sesame Street. So a big shout out to Sesame Street because I think I picked up a lot of English language skills
Yeah.
just from watching Jim Henson's Merry Band of Puppets and their human friends. So I arrived in kindergarten with some limited English skills and learned quickly.
Mm. So when did your interest in art and creativity take hold with you? When was it when you were a child or?
Yeah, I think the pivotal moment was probably when I was about 9 years old. I stole a few dollars from my mom's purse to buy a little drawing pad. Like I became, infatuated with this idea of having a drawing pad. And so I stole money and I bought a drawing pad and I was off to the races and I just started drawing. And, like a lot of kids, those early experiences with drawing uh, were um, were trying to draw Disney characters and superheroes. So that was my main fascination and what I was trying to get good at. And it was a fantastic experience to start drawing kind of on my own at the young age without encouragement or discouragement. Just it was just my thing,
Mhm.
and I learned to be comfortable being highly focused and quiet for long stretches of time because I was,
Mhm.
obsessing and fussing over my drawing. So I would be face down at the table, trying to draw Batman, and I needed to get
Mm.
it just right. So I kind of learned to be very comfortable with quiet and with focus. Uh, in
Mhm.
some ways, I think that my 9 year old self probably had a greater capacity to focus than my current 56-year-old self.
Oh, really? So, along the way, when did you realize that maybe this could be something that you can do for a living, or did you become interested when you were younger to be like a cartoonist or an artist?
um, I think that there is a really powerful class piece at work when you're thinking about who is comfortable or not calling themselves an artist. And I
Mhm.
think it took me, I had been, as I mentioned, making art since I was in elementary school. I never really stopped, whether it was visual art, which is my great love, or writing, which is something I really enjoy as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had never stopped making art, but it never occurred to me to call myself an artist. In fact, the first time I publicly self-identified that way, I was already 35 years old.
Oh,
So that was when I first started naming myself. At that point, I was self-taught at almost all of the visual art that I did. It was almost all entirely self-taught. I'd had one art class in middle school, but it felt like too much of an indulgence to pursue art and to call yourself that. It felt like, oh, that's something that some rich kid can do, but not me.
mm.
So
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 what
it
did
took a
you
long time.
study? I'm sorry.
I studied as an undergraduate. I studied communications, and I had a minor in English.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, because I waited, and I had a lot of challenges with just self-identifying as an artist. I was 38 years old when I finally applied to grad school to do an MFA in visual art in fine
Okay,
art.
at Berkeley.
Yeah, and that was at UC Berkeley. So I came in, well adult.
Okay.
I was not a fresh out of college, fresh-faced kid. I was already 38. I'd been in the workforce for years, and I went ahead and took the plunge and took that class, took that master's work on.
But even before you were an artist, I mean, your story is pretty incredible because you went from working in the fields as a young child with your family, and you went to an Ivy League college. You went to Penn. And I wanted to know if you can quickly just tell me how were you able to to do this? Because going to an Ivy League school is difficult for, nearly impossible for anyone.
Yeah.
But somebody at a disadvantage has even more difficulties.
Yeah, it was a interesting thing. Michael, immediately after finishing my undergraduate degree, I went to teach public high school in Japan. And I will tell you that I experienced more culture shock arriving at the University of Pennsylvania than I did
Yeah,
arriving at Japan. It was much
yeah.
more like disorienting and discombobulating to me to arrive in this setting, in this kind of elite college setting. Um, I think I think I lost track of your question as well. I'm sorry.
I just the process of going from being a child in San Juan Bautista and Watsonville to
Yes. Okay.
going to the Ivy League.
Yeah, it was interesting to suddenly be in a space of privilege, and to even though I was the first person in my family to kind of attend and complete an undergraduate degree, it was definitely a position of privilege, and it was a continuation of a feeling that I had growing up as the child of immigrants, of being on the inside of a culture, but also feeling on the outside of it. So it's that insider outsider duality
Mhm.
that's at play. Just growing up as a child of immigrants, it was always a question to me, like, do we belong here or do we not? Are we welcome here or are we not? And the answer was
Mhm.
yes and no. And so that
Mm.
feeling was always with me, and it certainly carried through to the college experience. And I am forever grateful to the University of Pennsylvania for providing this wonderful scholarship and making it possible for me to attend. And it was a great, great mind expanding experience for me, and
Mhm.
met some wonderful people as well. So it was a really good experience overall.
You got training to be a writer as well because you are in the world, you're immersed in the world, but you're not quite indoctrinated into the world. And
I,
that's what writers are.
Well, I think that's very astute, and I hadn't quite made that connection about how that basic insider outside orientation is really helpful for a writer. Absolutely, because you can have an intimacy with the world around you, but also an almost kind of a anthropological almost detachment from it.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of being outside, you're a gay man, and I was wondering how were you accepted within your community when you came out, or did you come out when you were younger?
While I was in Japan and I finally, had a full-time professional job as a teacher, I felt
Mhm.
strong enough to just go ahead and come out to my family. And part of what
Mm.
informed that was, okay, if I come out and I encounter rejection, if I'm cast out, now a
Mhm.
young working adult and I can handle my life.
Mhm.
And so I kind of went in with that mindset,
Mhm.
that I could handle it if I met with rejection, which is not what I met with. What I met
Mm.
with was, my father was. I was so taken aback. My father was very accepting. Um,
Yeah.
he just gave me a big hug, and I think it
Mhm.
was very hard for him to know that that was my reality and that was my life. But I think he also wanted to accept. My mother struggled more actually, which is interesting. Often it's the reverse, where the
Yeah.
father will find it more difficult, and the mother can be more accepting. But my mother, for religious reasons and out of just worry that she kept saying, your life is going to be harder. Your
Mm.
life is going to be harder. And I just told her, Mom, what's really hard is lying about your life all your life.
Mm.
That's really hard. And so I
Yes.
just tried to let her know that this was a choice that I felt very affirmative about. Um,
Mhm.
and they were accepting. And we had, in the aftermath of that, in the decades that followed, there was a kind of a silence around it. Like it's not something they brought up very often.
Mhm.
When I finally started dating someone, I brought him home and
Mhm.
introduced them, and it went just fine. But there was still a lot of kind of awkward silence around it.
Understandable. Because they probably didn't know how to act, first of all. And um, a lot of who you are reflects in your work, in your art, and as well as being an activist. And when you came back from Japan, I was just wondering, was this a new Jaime that came back from Japan to the United States as a gay man who's out, who is, Chicano? And did you feel some kind of pull toward expressing yourself in many different ways via art, via activism, via teaching and whatnot?
It was that kind of desire for multiple forms of self-expression. It was just a continuation that had been with me for quite some time.
Mhm.
As I mentioned, I've been doing visual art since I was a little kid, 8 years
Mhm.
old, and I started writing, my first little efforts at fiction shortly after that. In fact, I was in the third grade the first time I won an award for my stories. I
Wow.
wrote this. We had this little competition in the third grade for an Easter story that we were supposed to write and illustrate. So I wrote this story about Peter Rabbit and having a crisis of trying to get around to do his job in time and using an airplane to get to get to his destination. I vaguely remember this as the content, and I had these little drawings that went with it, and it came back and it had a little blue ribbon on it. I didn't even know what that meant. And I was like, "What is that?" And he said, "Oh, you won the prize." And, oh,
Wow.
so,
So your career was cut out for you in the third grade then. Did did you tell oral stories like to your family, or were you kind of a ham when you were a
I
kid?
I came from definitely a world of wonderful oral storytellers. My mother,
Mhm.
my father, my grandparents, they were all raconteurs with different levels of showmanship and different levels of raunchiness, and they were all funny. They were funny people. So I come from funny people, and I'm always grateful for that. And some of the stories they would share were really quite harrowing, but there was always this kind of humor and the resilience that it implies. So yeah,
Yeah.
it comes from that. Uh, in writing the stories in Gordo, when I write, I always speak the story out loud. I need to hear
Mhm.
it in my ears to know if it's right. I don't know if it's right until I hear it.
Mhm.
So yeah, that oral kind of storytelling history is very much with me.
I think that's how Richard Powers wrote the Overstory. He actually, I think, dictated it to himself, and it became a blockbuster. So, but as far as your other art, I want to show some of it here, if you don't mind.
Okay.
It's really beautiful work. This one, it's basketball, obviously, but it it struck me. It's with the color and the absence of human figures. It's just a wonderful piece of work.
Thank you. It's a fun drawing. That was a one-off. It was not part of a series. It was. I just became fascinated for a time by the drapery of the fabric in basketball, and how it, for me, references what you would see like the draping of an angel's robe in a Renaissance painting. It just has all that dynamic kind of sense of movement and sheen to it, which I liked. For me, there's also the erotic element of these three men's bodies, so in such close contact. That was my kind of, I am mostly indifferent to a lot of sports, but I am not indifferent to the kind of spectacle of men's bodies at work in proximity with each other. It's very captivating to me.
And when did you actually start doing art? I mean, you said you were actually doing visual art later in your life.
Yes, I began when I was in elementary school. I haven't done visual art for a couple of years now. I had been, focusing on my day job and trying to do this writing work that I had going on.
Okay, which we'll get to in a minute.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and so I've really slowed down on visual art, but looking at these makes me feel a tremendous melancholy yearning to be drawing again. Because it's my favorite thing.
This is my favorite piece of yours right now. It's just a beautiful piece. And oh man, it's just very striking. But your art caught the eye of somebody in the writing world, somebody pretty famous, Rebecca Solnit. And you did some. I actually saw this because I have this book about San Francisco, and you actually had me at the octopus, I should say, because it's just a great little drawing at the end of this wonderful book about San Francisco by Rebecca Solnit. So if you can talk a little bit, how did you get to work with her?
I think just wandered into it half accidentally, really. We had a mutual friend, a performance artist, Guillermo Gomez Peña, and we met at one of his kind of legendary parties that he would throw in San Francisco. And it would be parties that were full of all different manner of artists, and it included performers and musicians and visual artists and writers. And I met Rebecca at one of those events. He would also have these little, I guess, talent shows, you'd call them, where people would just share. They would sing a song, they would do a performance art piece. And I read from a story at one of these gatherings, and Rebecca took notice, and we began to just talk. And she became the great champion of what became Gordo.
Which is what we'll talk about now. But I have to say that I took notice when you did your first virtual event with her for City Lights. I said, this guy hit the big time already. And I have to say I was insanely jealous of you. But now that it was such a wonderful talk, because she is so great at everything she does.
It's been fantastic. A true angel in this whole process to me, and endlessly supportive and helpful. And I think she was able, she and my editor, John Freeman, both helped me to imagine these stories as a collection, because the stories were written over the course of a couple of decades, and I never intended to do a collection. I just wanted to tell a story, and then I wanted to tell another story and another one, and they really helped me to see how this could all hold together as a collection. And John in particular helped me to really work to kind of build more connective tissue to help hold these stories together. So you know, it's a wonderful gift when somebody sees what is in your work that you yourself can't even see it quite yet. So yeah.
This took 20 years. And I think you said you started with the Raimundo story 1998 or something.
Yeah, it's
and
like
then ended with Alex in 20 years later or something like that.
Yeah, and the most recent story, the one called Alex, was written in 2020. It's the newest. It's also the longest of the stories. I think it takes more than 50 pages of the book.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's been quite a span. In some ways, I would not say that it took me more than 20 years to do the book, because I never intended to do the book. But I would say that the stories, you know, accreted, they built up over this time span. And the actual kind of process of it becoming a book happened in more like four years, I would say. Just from the time I began to conceive of it as that, and people helped me to shape it that way.
So those actually were my two favorite stories. And the fact that they're written that far apart, I think it was really wonderful. I know I'm not going to ask you which is your favorite, but I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of something that you wrote from the book, so people can hear. And so go ahead and set it up. And
thank you. I'll be happy to read. I'm going to read just for a few minutes for you all. This is a story that is called The Nasty Book Wars. And it takes place in San Juan Bautista, and in the farm worker camps and in the fields. In this case, it starts in the garlic fields and ends at the farm worker camp. And I'm going to begin partway through the story and just give a little bit of context. The story kind of introduces the kind of community culture of those farm workers who know each other and their kids, and they all show up and work in the garlic fields near San Juan Bautista, near the Gilroy kind of area, which is a legendary garlic growing area. And it introduces a character, Primi. Primi he's a grown man. He's a drunk. He's hilarious and beloved and charming and bulldogish, and this kind of starts with talking about Primi and his capture by the Migra, the immigration services, deportation. It also kind of gets into the world of the little kids on the camp, who are very important in this book. There's a little mafia of kids that are all about the same age, somewhere between 6 and 14 years old. And they run the camp in their kid ways, and they have their rivalries and their ever shifting loyalties and meanness to each other, and so it kind of gets into the world of the kids as well. So that's a little bit of context for you, and I'll just begin. And Primi, because he basically had no neck, was called Head and Shoulders by people in the camp. So Head and Shoulders refers to Primi. Head and Shoulders' last day at the Gyrick Farms worker camp came within a week of his wedding. 3 dark green Migra vans descended on the garlic fields right before the mid-morning break. They braked hard, kicking up clouds of dust. 4 INS agents in khaki uniforms exploded from the open doors. It scared me when several young workers bolted. They seemed so adult to me mere moments before, so full of the bravado and that physical competence of young men, hefting bushel baskets of garlic onto their shoulders with thoughtless ease. In a moment, they had been stripped of that and had been made into prey, fleeing to hide underneath cars or behind the stacked crates of garlic. I panic and turn wide-eyed towards my mother. Should we run, Ma? Should we run? What are you talking about? You're a citizen. You're born here. They can't take you away. I was not reassured by her words. What about you, Ma? You were born in Mexico. Yes, but I have my papers, she said. Now mind your own business. Keep on working. I watched his head and shoulders rose up slowly, calmly. He walked a few steps, then he began running. It wasn't even 10 in the morning, but he had already sucked down 2 Coors tall boys and was working on a third, so he was wobbly, lurching towards the tall cattails on the banks of the irrigation ditch. Coors in hand, he tripped over a clod. Brimi sprawled on the ground, arms and legs spread out like the Carl's Jr. star. His beer shot forth a geyser of foam, but amazingly, he never let the beer can go. 2 INS agents surrounded him, and one helped him up by the elbow. Brimi stood, and with his feet free hand, he sheepishly dusted himself off. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping and eyes turning dirtward as he emptied his lungs. Oh no. I looked at Brimi and he winked. He raised his beer can to his lips, tilted his head back, opened his throat, and poured in the pissy remains. Conspicuously pregnant Jello cried silently as Head and Shoulders bent his back and entered the rear maw of the INS van. Ligo tilted his head, sucked his teeth, and intoned, "Ah, well, at least he got to finish his course." That evening, the foreman's wife, Clarita, cleared out Head and Shoulders' tiny rental room in the big house. We called it that because it was the only 2-story building in the worker camp, with 3 little rooms on the ground floor and 3 little rooms on the second floor. The rooms all held a wardrobe, a chair, a twin-size bed, and a night table. Only the colorful calendars, family photos, and knickknacks differentiated them. Clarita packed his clothes into grocery bags in case he should return, looking sadly at his undershirts, stiff and murky gray from bad washings with colored clothes, insufficient detergent, and clearly no fabric softener. "A man without a woman," she said to the empty room as she Ajaxed his hot plate for the next tenant, "is a sad animal. Sad. Don't know how to take care of themselves. A wonder they can wipe their own culos." From behind the big willow tree that fronted the high house, my older sister Sylvie, my older cousin Cesar, my little cousin Tiny, and I surveyed the cleaning with a vulture's watchfulness. Clarita packed his radio, Sunday Stetson hat, coin jar, and a few other valuables into a box for safekeeping at her house. As soon as she left and padlocked the door, we circled around the back of the high house. We studied the window. She hadn't locked it, but there was a window latch that would make it impossible to open it all the way. Caesar punched through the rusted screen and pried the window open with a jackknife. It only opened a few inches, but it was big enough for me to push Tiny through. Once inside, Tiny opened the latch. I opened the window wide, and we all climbed in. We went right to work, rooting around the room, hoping to find a spare dime under the bed, or matches, or comic books, or candy, or beef jerky, or maybe even cigarettes. Sylvie opened the double doors of the rough-hewn wardrobe, and she and Cesar peered into the interior. They gasped simultaneously. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," squealed Sylvie. "What is it?" I asked. "Oh my good God," said Caesar. Together, they dragged out a brown grocery bag filled to the top with nasty girl magazines. Jackpot! We swooped down on the bag, tearing it as we each reached in to yank out nasty books. Each of us grabbed a handful and retreated from the others like wolves, protecting their hunks of deer leg from the pack. "Ooh," I chanted from behind my copy of Cherry. "You could see her guts." Turned the centerfold around so everyone could see the eviscerated blonde. "That's not her guts, stupid," said Caesar. "That's her pussy." At 13, almost 14, Caesar was the oldest and our resident sexpert. Tiny, only 7, was as confused as I was. "How come it's all hairy?" she asked. Caesar had had enough. "You're a bonehead, Tiny. Get out of here. This isn't for little kids." Caesar shoved her towards the open window. Tiny became teary-eyed and pleaded her case. "I was just asking how come it's all hairy. I let you in, so you can't throw me out." "Get out, little baby," hollered Caesar. I'm gonna tell Mom, she threatened, her voice quavering. And she's gonna kick your ass. All right then, Caesar agreed. Shut up. Don't ask any more stupid questions. I'm just asking, how come it's so hairy? That's all. Poor little baby, said Sylvie. When women grow up, they get hair. When you grow up, you're going to get hair down there too. No, sir. Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, Tiny, your mom probably has hair down there, a big old bush. No, sir, she wouldn't have all that hair, would she? She has all kinds of hair, said Sylvie, probably down to her knees. Like it or don't. The revelation was too much for Tiny. She began to wail. All right, that does it, said Caesar. You girls, get out of here. We gotta take these books and put in someplace safe. They're not your books, you know, countered Sylvie. I was the one who opened the doors to the closet, she said. But I saw them first, said Caesar. But I touched them first, said Sylvie. And Tiny got us inside, and Gordo got her through the window. So we found the books together. They're everybody's. That's fair. There are a lot of nasty books. We can share, I said. God, what kind of sissy idea is that? Asked Caesar. Don't you get it, Gordo? What do the girls want them for? These books aren't for girls, they're for men. You're not men, said Sylvie. You're only boys. And the girls want to look at the pictures too. Teary-eyed Tiny nodded her head in agreement. These books belong to the boys, Caesar proclaimed, and we're taking them. Yeah, the boys, I added, eager to redeem myself as a dutiful foot soldier in Caesar's eyes. Suddenly, Sylvie grabbed a handful of magazines and made for the window. Caesar grabbed Sylvie by the pigtail and pulled her back into the room, and they began to struggle. Sylvie dropped the magazines, and both of them slid around on the glossy paper. Tiny and I entered the fray, and there ensued a tremendous ripping of paper, yanking of hair and centerfolds, and opportunistic biting. The girls were scrappy, but they were no match for Cesar's brutal rabbit punches and my size. In short order, we expelled them through the window and latched it behind them. For added effect, Caesar closed the curtains. Sylvie, with a bit of crumpled centerfold still in her clenched fist, rapped the window with her knuckles. Open the window, Gordo. You know we should get some of these too. I panted for a moment and shouted back at her through the curtain. These are for the boys, Sylvie. You go and find your own dirty books. There aren't any, so the boys have to share. Caesar opened the curtains, stuck his face to the window, and brayed his evil laugh. Sylvie flipped him off with both her hands, repeatedly stabbing the air with her middle finger for emphasis. Tiny tried to imitate the gesture, but flipped us off with her ring finger instead, sending me and Caesar into paroxysms of laughter. We'll be back, idiots, shouted Sylvie, and we'll bring hell. Caesar and I collapsed on the floor, rolling around in our spoils like Scrooge McDuck writhing around in his vast vault of coins. Caesar humped the floor lasciviously, kissed the centerfolds, and laughed like the supervillain in training that he was.
Hello. You know, it's so much better hearing you read it than it is reading it. I mean, it's wonderful reading it, but how you increase the pace as soon as they discover the magazines, it just made it. I'm gonna have to reread it.
And that was definitely something that really happened. We found a stash of porn.
Oh, really?
And there was such a kerfuffle about who should be the keeper of the porn.
Yeah.
It was a huge battle with the kids about the porn when we found that stash.
What about the part about the stomach and and you mistaken the other part?
Yes. Well, it was an interesting thing because I was thinking a lot about what it meant back then to see pornographic images because they were so forbidden and so inaccessible, and it was such a different world than that of children today who, if they have internet access and they're curious, they can find an endless kind of variety of porno. Like it's all there. Literally a world of porno is all there. But back then it was all, analog. Like you either had access to these books, these porn magazines, or you didn't. And if you're curious, there was so few outlets for like, fulfilling that curiosity by actually getting to see these naked bodies. So it was really something.
How were you able? Are all these stories recreations, or are they part recreation and part things that you conjure up yourself?
I would say that the great majority of these stories are based on things that really happened. So we were talking
Mm-hmm.
about the longest story, Andy. That really happened. We had a neighbor, and I didn't realize initially that this person was a butch lesbian woman. I thought
Mm-hmm.
she was just a kind of a peculiar dude. And
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that Andy did have a bride that came from El Salvador as a
Mm-hmm.
refugee, and we learned over time that Andy was terrorizing and physically and emotionally abusing her, and my mom really did help her out.
Wow.
This poor
Wow.
woman who was trapped in this abusive relationship. So there's a lot of real stuff that happened in there, and I just kind of took it and in some cases tweaked it a bit,
Yeah.
uh, and just kind of built the story that way. I think the interesting challenge was to, you remember the stories of your childhood with your adult mind, and
Mm-hmm.
the trick is, can you take yourself back to your child mind and remember what it really felt like, and not bring your adult knowing and your adult sophistication to it. Just try to try to
Mm.
try to just barricade your adult self out of the story.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really interesting challenge.
That story alone is so powerful and so incredible. I mean, I was just kind of in awe of not only the story but your prose. It was so beautifully written,
Thank you.
and yes. But you know what you had mentioned about memories, visual memories. I'd like to ask you that, because you did a lot of music, you included a lot of music and also food. And I'm wondering, those had to have helped you remember a lot of those things, because I can taste the frijoles or hear the mariachi music, and I can hear it while I'm reading this, or I can kind of viscerally smell like fresh tortillas while I'm reading your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think much smarter people than I have explored in depth the profound connection between our smell and our memory. It's
Mhm.
a fascinating one, and of course, this very much connects to food, and those food smells. There's
Mhm.
so much history locked up in those scents. Um, we grew up surrounded by different kinds of agriculture, and one of the things that was really common in San Benito County, because you get these really warm, hot summers, was tomatoes.
Mhm.
And for me, I grow tomatoes here at my house every year, and just running my hands across the leaves and just smelling that, it just takes me right back. That smell is so absolutely packed
Mhm.
with that memory. And I think we've all experienced it in different ways. And put your nose up to a box of Crayolas, and you're in kindergarten. You're back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so those things are interesting to me. Um, I think it was also, for me, the food piece um, was it was kind of my mother was a wonderful cook, and in some ways, like, we were rich because we were
Mhm.
in a setting where someone was making these spectacular, beautiful food. Like, she made handmade flour tortillas a couple times a week. Like, to me now, that just feels
Wow.
like the most extravagant luxury. But of course, for her and that generation of women, that was the basics of being the mom, is that you need to make tortillas, a week, once a week or a couple times a week as needed. But to me now, like, if someone were to make me a nice flour tortilla like that, I would just melt. It really would
Oh, really?
be amazing to me to just have that back. So yeah, the food piece and the smell piece, they're very hand in hand for me. The music piece is also, it's almost a cliche that like in movies or in books, you use music as a shorthand way of saying, of telling people what time period you're in. And I
Mhm.
think I definitely did that as well. I like talking about some of the music from that era, whether that,
Mhm.
the early disco song, The Hustle by Van
Yeah.
McCoy, or the Mexican rancheras that
Mhm.
my father and his drinking buddies used to just wail to, and they would be singing it at the top of their lungs and crying like babies. And that was the one place, the one setting where it was perfectly permissible. If you're drunk and you're listening to those rancheras, everybody gets to cry, and no one thinks twice about it. So the music piece is significant for me. There's so much emotion that gets kind of channeled through the music,
Mhm.
especially in cultures where you have a lot of stoicism. The music is a place to release, and it's important that way.
Mhm. And your way of expressing it, I mentioned the prose is brilliant, but what I really like is how you were able to alternate the humor and sadness, and younger and slightly older yourselves of Gordo, which I assume is you, and just the perspective that each has, but also appreciating the humor and having the sadness affect you. And it still seems like it affects you a little bit.
Yeah, those two are. I try to hold the humor and the tragedy in a productive friction in these
Mhm.
stories, and the two often get paired. There's not much funny stuff in the book that's not also completely coupled up with something sad. And so I really like that combination. I find that there's something about that feels like whenever I witness something that really has this balance of the tragic and the comic, I just feel like this is the intensity of life. This is what it is.
Mm.
Um, Sometimes I think of emojis. They're so incredibly popular, and they've basically
Yeah.
become a kind of de facto punctuation for us now. But I
Yeah.
always think there's other ones that I want to see, like the ones that perfectly expresses laughter through tears. So
Uh,
there's emojis that where someone is crying from laughing so hard,
yeah.
but there's not one that feels like you're heartbroken and you're laughing.
Mm.
And I find that to be a really beautiful emotional place to explore that which cracks your heart open and sews it back up.
Mm. And of course, all this is about life. And the one that really got to me was a story about um, a funeral. And you experience a death of somebody up close. Oh, it's Ophelia's Last Ride, I think it was
Ophelia's
called. Yeah.
Last Ride, yes.
Yeah. But view of death as a child, I thought was a really difficult thing, but you managed to pull it off. And
Oh, thank you.
did,
That was a
did,
challenge. That was a challenge.
did you have a personal experience of death as a young child?
Um, I remembered her death, the lady who that was based on, and
Mm.
she happened to die while we were in visiting my grandmother in Mexicali, right over the border in Baja
Mhm.
California. And I
Mhm.
was just remembering everything around it uh, that was funny and ultimately also really sad. Again, that pairing, which is uh, my sweet spot that I really like to operate in. I think it was
Yeah.
very much in effect, and I do remember distinctly like being confused about, she was a kind of a hard drinking body lady, and she loved pro wrestling, and we did it. When she died,
Yeah.
we did three
Brings her up.
three trips around the wrestling stadium because that was her great love, and we took her to the jail, and they let her son come out for a moment from his cell to pay his respects. That really happened.
So that really happened where her son, you took it to, oh my goodness.
Yeah. He was. I did not get to see that moment, but I know that it happened, and my parents told me about it. They saw it.
Wow. So
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah,
I
it's an
yeah.
interesting thing, the brutality of being in prison, and this kind of really remarkable, fascinating way for me in Mexican culture. There's so much brutality and tenderness bundled up
Mhm.
together. To let someone come out to pay respects is
Mm,
a gesture of kind of mercy and generosity. Um,
mhm.
uh, uh, yeah.
Wow. We got a couple questions and we're running low on time, but I wanted to ask you one more thing about why, actually two more quick things. Why you chose to write it as a fiction piece rather than a memoir.
Well, a couple of the stories are fiction. The
Yeah.
Raimundo stories, those are fictions.
Okay.
They're kind of based on an actual person, uh, but there's really that's the one place where I kind of cobbled together things that really happened from a whole bunch of
Mhm,
different eras of my life
mhm.
and kind of put them together. So it was not quite accurate to call it a memoir, though I would say that it's probably more than half memoir, definitely more than
Mhm,
half. So I
mhm.
just call it semi-autobiographical fiction,
Okay.
for lack
Okay.
of a better kind of a more elegant way of referring to it. It's uh, most of the stuff in those stories really did happen,
Okay.
but not all of it. So just
Okay. Okay. I have one more question, then we have two from the audience. The response has been amazing, especially NPR. I mean, comparing you to Steinbeck, and I just wanted your reaction to, was that a positive thing for you? I mean, it's obviously a flattering thing, but
um,
it's also kind of puts some pressure on you, I would think.
yeah, I was a little flabbergasted when I saw that. I was completely not expecting something like that. For a person who's like me, who was publishing their first short story collection, and to have a national outlet, kind of doing a kind of comparison or referencing Steinbeck that way, uh,
Yeah.
it's not for a first time author to be compared to a Nobel laureate with this vast library of books that he has written.
Yeah.
I would never go there or compare myself in any way to that. I would say that there is a lineage that I belong to that he is part of. So that was accurate. I'm doing
Okay.
something somewhat in that vein, but obviously
Mhm.
his accomplishments are phenomenal and remarkable, and I'm a long ways from anything like that, but it's
Mhm.
flattering. And I think it is accurate to say that there's a lineage of this kind of storytelling of kind of working class farm workers that in this area that this book now belongs to.
Okay. Great. Thomas wanted to know, what does your family think of the book?
I just a couple of weeks ago I went to our first big family gathering since the pandemic hit. It was a wedding
Yeah.
for a cousin.
Yeah.
And so many branches of the family gathered for this lovely wedding. And a whole bunch of people kind of came up to me at different points, and they enjoyed it so much. I had an aunt tell me, Jaime, I've read 5 books in my whole life, cover to cover, and this is one of them, and I absolutely love this book.
Oh,
So that was really sweet to hear. uh,
yeah.
and So that was wonderful, and we just sat and we talked and we laughed and we remembered, and that meant everything to me. Like I just
Yeah.
felt like if I ended up getting, well reviewed in the New York Times and NPR, but my family hated it, it would feel like a failure to me. It
Oh,
really would
yeah.
have felt like a
Okay.
failure. I didn't realize how much I wanted them to approve of it and like it until I got the approval. And
Mm,
I was so happy and so relieved. And and it was just uniformly very positive, the
Yeah.
response. And they are identifying actual people who some of the characters are based on, and asking, hey, was this character supposed to be like that, or was that me? That was one that came up several times, and I'm like, yeah, that's a lot of you, but not entirely you.
That's a great answer for them too. The good parts are about you, but the bad parts are made up. The title Gordo, really quick. Were you called Gordo when you were young?
In kind of a working class Mexican setting, a kid should expect to go through at least 5 or 6 major nicknames in their childhood. And Gordo is one of them, and there were so many of them. And that was fun. It's just culturally, that's just what happens. And
Yeah.
in some ways, I was certainly called gordito by many people, a fat kid. And I always think there's something really interesting in Spanish when you add the suffix ito onto the end of something. It's a diminutive, it's an endearment. And things that might otherwise feel like judgmental or negative become very tender. So gordo, fat kid, it becomes my fat kid, my dear little fat kid.
Okay.
Negrito, my dear little dark one,
Fine.
just that kind of stuff. Güerito, my dear little light-skinned one. So I think that that was definitely one of the many nicknames I cycled through growing up. And to be nicknamed is to belong. It's a belonging thing.
Yeah. My late father, his name is Gordo, Goro.
Oh, is that right?
Okay. He owned a gas station in the east side of town, which is predominantly Mexican. And when they heard his name, they would just laugh and laugh because he was kind of chubby. So.
Oh, he was, okay, yeah.
So that was his real name.
I remember quickly one interesting thing when I was living in Japan and teaching, and I learned this really kind of interesting phrasing that people in the teacher's room, the other teachers, had to connote that someone was really an insider, and they would say, so instead of saying Jaime-san, my first name with honorific san at the end, it would be Uchi no Jaime, our Jaime.
Okay.
Uchi, which also means house, and it's just has this connotation of intimacy and you belong. So nicknames are belonging.
That's very endearing. All right, we have one more question. Somebody wants to know when are you going to write a novel? Because about one of your stories. This is great stuff, he said.
Oh, thank you. It's an interesting question. I think my mind works in short stories. I had a very dear friend release a novel just like 10, 12 days before my book was released. I read it and I just couldn't believe how complex the story structure was. It was boggling my mind, like how you hold all that plot twisting in your mind. So I don't know if I have the skill to do a novel, but I might give it a try. It was interesting working on the Alex story in the book. That thing got longer and longer, and it kind of made me understand like the power of the long form story, like what can be built into it. The kind of character development that you can do is really potent. So that feels really exciting, and I might try my hand at that someday. Yeah,
I agree with the viewer. I think you should, because you are a wonderful talent, and you need to share more out into the world for all of us.
Thank you for your vote of encouragement.
Well, Jaime, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. It was really, really a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Michael, for hosting me and asking such great questions. And I would like to thank everyone who took the time to show up. I appreciate your presence and support. And I look forward to the future when we can do these things in person more often so I can connect with you more. But thank you, everyone.
So if you haven't bought Gordo Stories yet, please do. It is a wonderful book. And thank you, everyone, for